Out here in the Arizona Territory, folks used to say the desert only ever speaks in two voices. One is so quiet you can hear your own blood moving. The other is loud enough to bury a man without a shovel. On the Tuesday it began, the land chose the quiet one. The Dragoon Mountains sat like dark teeth on the horizon, watching the valley below. August heat didn't just shine, it leaned down and pressed on everything that dared to breathe. The air shimmered, mesquite rattled dry pods. Even the cicadas sounded tired, like they were saving strength for later. Behind a small log cabin tucked into that hard country, Kora Abernathy split woodfire with the kind of focus you only learn when nobody's coming to help. No wasted swings, no complaining, just a clean rhythm. Lift, strike, crack. Each log broke like a final word in an argument. Kora was 22, but the territory had a way of making people look older than their years. Sun and wind had tanned her skin the color of saddle leather. Her hands were rough, scarred from rope and thorn. Her eyes were pale and steady, like a piece of sky that never blinked. In the nearest settlement, Bitter Creek, they called her the Spring Girl when they were thirsty, and the Hermit when they wanted to laugh. She didn't give them water. She didn't give them stories. She kept her world small on purpose. A stout cabin, a stubborn garden, 2 mules, a few hens, and the spring, cold and constant, seeping out of stone like the desert had accidentally let mercy slip through a crack. Her father had built this place before the roads were honest and before the law bothered to arrive on time. He taught her how to read weather, how to track, how to shoot straight, how to keep her boots dry. Most of all, he taught her one rule that mattered out here. Never assume a stranger's smile means anything. Then fever took him and her mother, both gone before Kora had a chance to become someone else. After that, 15 years passed with nothing but her own voice, the wind, and the occasional distant howl. Solitude wasn't just her habit, it was her armor. That's why she noticed the silence first. The sparrows in the cottonwood by the spring, usually noisy, always busy, went dead quiet. Not one chirp, not one flutter. The wind didn't stop, but it shifted, and it carried something underneath the dust and sun-baked stone. Horse sweat. Kora set the axe down slowly, not in panic, never in panic. Her right hand slid to the rifle propped against the woodpile, an old Springfield with worn bluing and a stock polished by years of use. She didn't raise it yet. She just turned her head and looked toward the western ridge, where the rocks rose like a wall. For a moment, there was nothing but heat haze, that watery mirage that makes the world look like it's melting. Then the ridge moved. 7 riders appeared at the crest, as if the stone itself had decided to stand up and stare back. They didn't come in scattered like drifters, and they didn't ride like a posse hungry for trouble. They came in a straight line, evenly spaced, disciplined. 7 men on tough paint ponies, their silhouettes sharp against the washed-out sky. Chiricahua Apache. Anyone in southern Arizona could tell, not just by their hair and their weapons, but by the way they sat their saddles like the horses were an extension of their bodies. No slouching, no nervous shifting, just control. They started down the slope, slow, hooves picking carefully through rock and scrub. No war whoops, no shouting, no show, and somehow that quiet made it worse. Kora lifted her rifle and brought it to her shoulder. The barrel tracked the line of riders as they descended, her breathing steady, her stance planted in the dirt like she meant to stay there forever. They reached the valley floor and stopped well out from her cabin, about 50 yards or so, far enough to say they weren't forcing their way in, close enough to say they weren't passing through. The man in the center dismounted. He was tall, not the kind of tall that belongs to tall tales, but tall enough to make you think twice. He moved with the calm weight of someone who didn't need to prove anything. His hair was tied back simply, a single feather riding along the braid like a quiet mark of rank. His face looked carved by weather and responsibility. High cheekbones, a hard mouth, eyes dark and level, like obsidian that didn't care what you believed. He stepped forward alone. And the strange part was this. His hands were empty, held slightly out from his sides, palms open. A peace gesture, plain as day. Kora cocked the rifle. That small metallic click sounded enormous in the heat. "That's close enough," she called, and her voice came out rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. "State your business, then turn around and ride back the way you came." The man stopped. He didn't flinch, didn't glance back at his riders for guidance. He just looked at her with the steady attention of someone who'd been searching for something and had finally found it. When he spoke, his English was careful, formal, like a man handling a blade. "We did not come for your water." Kora didn't lower the rifle. "Then why are you here?" He let a pause settle between them, slow and deliberate. "My name is Gochimin," he said. "I lead these riders." Behind him, the other 6 stayed mounted and silent, eyes fixed on Kora without heat, without softness, just watchful attention, like wolves that haven't decided if they're hungry. Gochiman took a slow breath, choosing his words with the patience of someone who believed time was on his side. "We came," he said, "to ask for your hand in marriage." For a heartbeat, the valley felt like it tilted. Marriage was something Kora associated with town. Paper, preachers, rings that turned green on fingers, promises that lasted until the next payday. Marriage wasn't something that rode in on horseback and stopped in your yard like it owned the air. A short laugh escaped her, sharp, startled, almost ugly. "You've got the wrong cabin." Gochiman didn't change his expression, not even a flicker. "No," he replied, "we have the right one." Kora raised the rifle a fraction higher, sighting him clean. "You take one more step, I drop you." The men behind him didn't lift their weapons. They didn't even shift in their saddles. But the pony's ears angled forward, and the air tightened, as if the animals themselves were listening. Gochiman said quiet and steady, "We will not take you. We will not hurt you." "Then you can leave," Kora snapped back. He held her gaze. "We cannot," he said. And for the first time there was something in his voice that wasn't calm. Not anger, not threat. Obligation. Kora's finger tightened on the trigger. She could feel the weight of the rifle in her shoulder, the heat on her neck, the heartbeat in her wrist. Everything in her life had trained her for raiders, for thieves, for desperate men who wanted her spring. Not for this. 7 riders, no shouting, no gunfire, just a proposal spoken like a vow. The desert stayed silent around them, as if the land itself was waiting to see what she would do. Kora didn't fire. Not because she doubted her aim, not because she trusted him, because her father's voice rose up from memory, calm as ever. "Don't start a war you can't finish. Don't spend a bullet just to buy yourself a worse problem." So she held her ground, rifle steady, eyes locked on Gochiman's chest, and let the silence stretch, thin, hot, and dangerous. And somewhere above them, the sun kept pressing down, like a hand that didn't care whose life it was squeezing. Kora didn't fire. Not because she doubted her aim, not because she suddenly trusted a man she'd never met. She didn't fire because her father's lessons still lived in her bones, and one of them always came first. Don't start a fight you can't finish. So she held that rifle steady, jaw clenched, and let the silence hang until it felt heavier than the heat. "I'm not anybody's bride," she said at last, her voice flat as sun-baked stone. "Not yours, not anyone's. You and your men turn around and ride back over that ridge." Gochiman didn't argue. That was the unsettling part. No anger, no bargaining, no threats. He simply looked at her like he'd heard her words and was waiting for the part underneath them. "We will camp," he said. Kora's eyes narrowed. "On the far side of my land." A small nod. "We will not come near your cabin without your word." It sounded almost polite, almost reasonable, and it still felt like a trap. Kora spat the words out like nails. "Then do it, camp, and when the sun rises, you'll be gone." Gochiman stepped backward, slow and controlled, never turning his back on her. He returned to the line of riders. One quiet motion of his hand, and the 7 of them guided their ponies down toward the base of the ridge, still on her valley floor, but far enough away to show they weren't trying to rush her door. Kora watched them set up like men preparing for a long wait. No bright fire, no rowdy talk, no careless movement. They worked with the steady efficiency of people who'd survived too many nights to waste any of them. A low windbreak went up. Horses were tethered, bedrolls unrolled in a neat line. The whole thing looked less like a raid and more like permanence. That scared her more than a shout ever could. She backed toward her cabin without taking her eyes off them, then slipped inside and slammed the door. The thick wooden bar dropped into place with a heavy scrape. It should have felt like safety. Instead, it felt like the world had just gotten smaller. Kora leaned against the door and forced her breathing to slow. Her hands shook anyway, anger and adrenaline both. She kept the rifle across her knees and listened. She expected hoofbeats. She expected them to ride off. But outside there was only wind, and the soft return of the birds, like nature itself decided it had to keep going, no matter what strange men showed up in the valley. She crept to the window and peered through a narrow crack in the shutter. They were still there. A dark cluster near the ridge, moving calmly, a faint thread of smoke from a small, careful fire, 7 figures settling into the lands as if they'd been born out of it. Night fell fast, the way it always did in the territory. The moon rose and turned the rocks silver. Coyotes called once from far off, then went quiet again, like they'd been warned. Kora didn't sleep. Not truly. She lay on her narrow cot with the rifle close enough to grab, staring at the ceiling boards, listening to every creak, every rustle, every shift of wind across the roof. At some point, she heard something faint, so low she wondered if she imagined it. A humming chant drifting across the dark. No words she understood, just a rhythm, steady as breathing. It put a cold line down her spine. She told herself it was nothing. Work songs, prayer, a man passing time. Still, without thinking, her hand found her father's old pocket Bible. The leather was cracked and worn. She didn't open it, she just held it like a habit, like a memory, like something that could keep the night from leaning too close. Dawn came pale and cool. Kora unbarred the door and stepped out, rifle in hand. The first thing she saw stopped her. On the flat stone near her porch, a rabbit lay dressed clean. Skinned, gutted, ready for a pan. Not thrown, not tossed, placed neatly like an offering. Kora stared at it as if it might bite her. Her mind went straight to suspicion. Poison. Trick. Some kind of message she didn't want to accept. She crouched and examined it. Smell, color, any sign of tampering. Nothing. Just meat. Good meat. And the desert didn't forgive waste. So, with a tight, reluctant breath, she carried it inside. She cooked it in her cast-iron skillet, the grease popping softly, the smell filling the cabin with a warmth she didn't ask for. She ate alone at her rough table, chewing slowly, feeling the strange weight of it. A meal given by men who claimed they'd come to marry her, men who didn't cross her yard, didn't demand anything, didn't even speak. Outside, the Apache riders sat with their backs to the ridge, facing outward like sentries. They didn't wave, they didn't call to her, they just watched the valley the way a man watches weather. 3 days passed like that. Kora threw herself into work as if hard labor could drown out dread. She hauled water from the spring, weed-pulled the garden, checked the mule tack, counted her ammunition more times than she'd admit. Every time she looked toward the ridge, the camp was still there. Always there. And always patient. That patience became its own kind of pressure. Raiders could be fought, drifters could be chased off, but men who simply waited, men who didn't break rules, men who acted like time belonged to them. Kora didn't know what to do with that. On the 4th morning, Kora faced the truth in her pantry. The flour was almost gone, the salt tin scraped low. She could live on rabbit and beans, sure, but not forever, not without running into town. The thought of leaving her homestead unguarded made her stomach twist. But staying put wasn't an option either. Hunger could kill just as cleanly as a bullet. She stepped out into the yard and drew a line in the dirt with the toe of her boot, 10 paces from her porch. A boundary, sharp and simple. Past that, and I shoot, she said to the empty air. It felt foolish the moment she did it. The desert didn't care about lines. And yet, the men by the ridge did. They stayed back. By dawn, Kora had made her choice. She saddled her mule, tied on 2 burlap sacks, slung her rifle across her shoulder, and opened her cabin door. The Apache camp was already awake. Gochaman stood near the small fire with a cup in his hand, steam rising into the cool air. He watched her without moving. He didn't try to stop her, didn't call after her, didn't follow. That, too, felt like a kind of confidence. Kora led the mule along the trail out of the valley, keeping a wide berth around the camp. As she passed, she could feel eyes on her, 7 pairs, steady and silent. Not like hunger, not like hatred, like attention, like waiting. She didn't look back. The trail stretched out in front into open desert, dust rising around the mule's hooves in the early light. Behind her, the cabin shrank into the valley, and the ridge stood as it always had, quiet, immovable. But now the quiet had changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was presence. And Kora rode toward town with a cold, uneasy thought she couldn't shake. Whatever those men wanted, they believed it was already halfway theirs. By the time Kora Abernathy reached Bitter Creek, the sun was high and mean, and the mule under her looked just as tired of the world as she did. The town sat out there like a rough idea someone had nailed together in a hurry. One dusty street, a row of false front buildings, and enough whiskey inside those walls to convince men they were braver than they really were. Kora rode in slow, keeping her eyes forward. She didn't come to visit. She didn't come to talk. She came to trade money for flour and salt and leave before the town remembered she existed. But Bitter Creek always remembered. Not kindly, just eagerly. Heads turned as she passed. Men on porches paused with that bored, hungry curiosity folks get when something different walks into their day. Kora felt it like sunburn. She'd been the spring girl for so long that even here, miles from her valley, her name came with a rumor attached. She tied the mule at the hitching post outside the general store and stepped into the cooler darkness inside. The place smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust that had settled into every board. Shelves held tins and cloth and tools. Barrels of crackers and nails and sugar lined the walls like a stubborn attempt at civilization. Behind the counter stood Lindy Shaw, middle-aged, white, tough around the eyes, with a pencil tucked behind her ear like it belonged there permanently. She looked up, took Kora in, and gave her a faint, knowing expression. "Well," Lindy said, like she was greeting a storm cloud, "the mountains finally let you out alive again." Kora didn't smile. She set a small coin pouch on the counter and kept her voice short. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition." Lindy's pencil hovered over her ledger. "Ammunition, huh? Only thing folks buy cheerful these days." Kora's eyes flicked toward the doorway, then back. She could have kept her mouth shut. She usually did. But 4 days of 7 silent riders in her valley had been grinding against her nerves like sand in a boot. And the sheriff back in her mind, his shrug, his nothing, only made the pressure worse. So she said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. 7 Apache are camped on my land." Lindy froze. The pencil stopped moving. Somewhere in the aisle, a man near the cracker barrel slowed his chewing. "Camped?" asked Lindy, careful. Kora swallowed and pushed on, because stopping now would mean she'd have to admit how strange it sounded. "They're not stealing, not threatening. Their leader asked me to marry him." The words landed in the store like a rock dropped into a well. For a beat, nobody spoke. Then a laugh came from the back, dry, sharp, and not friendly. A man stepped into the light like he owned it. Cyrus Dane, clean vest, polished boots, neatly trimmed mustache. The kind of handsome that looked better the farther away he was. He ran cattle north of the Dragoons and had been sniffing around Kora Spring for years, trying to buy what she refused to sell. "Miss Abernathy," Dane said, tipping his hat with practiced charm. His eyes didn't match the gesture. "I had heard you were particular about your company. Looks like the territory decided to test that." Kora's face hardened. "They're on my land. I want them gone." Dane leaned against a display of nails like this was entertainment. "Well now, that's dangerous. A young woman alone with a spring that runs year-round? That's a beacon, Miss Abernathy. The Apaches know it. Everybody knows it." Lindy's gaze snapped to him, displeased. "Kyrus, you don't start." But Dane didn't stop. He smiled wider, like he could taste opportunity. "You should see Sheriff Holcomb. He'll put together a posse, run them off." Kora didn't miss the gleam behind his calm. Men like Dane didn't give advice unless it served them, and the way he said posse sounded less like help and more like a plan. Still, she didn't have many options. She paid for her supplies, took the tied bundles, and walked out into the blinding street heat. The sheriff's office sat across the way, small and tired-looking, with a little jail cell beside it that probably held more drunks than criminals. Inside, Sheriff Holcomb looked like a man who'd been worn down by years of dust and disappointment. He listened while Kora told the story again. 7 Apache, peaceful camp, a proposal so strange it still didn't feel real in her own mouth. When she finished, Holcomb leaned back like he'd just heard a tall tale at a saloon table. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. 7 Cherokee Apache sitting quiet on your ground, not stealing, not hurting anyone, one of them asking you to marry him." "Yes," Kora said, her teeth clenched. Holcomb sighed and rubbed his face. "So, sounds like you got a problem but not a crime. If they ain't doing harm, I can't ride out there and start shooting. Army gets touchy about that. Folks get buried over misunderstandings. Kora felt heat rise in her chest, hotter than the desert sun. So you're doing nothing? Holcomb's expression didn't change. I'm telling you what I can tell you. Keep your rifle clean and your head cooler than your temper. That was it. That was all the law had for her. Kora stood there a moment, feeling smaller than she had in her own valley, because in the valley, at least, she knew where she stood. Here, she was just a woman with a story nobody wanted to touch. She turned on her heel and left without another word. Outside, she loaded her supplies onto the mule quickly, straps tight, knots clean. She swung up into the saddle with a controlled, angry grace. And that's when she saw Dane again. He stood on the saloon porch, watching her like he'd been waiting for the scene to end the way he wanted. He tipped his hat again, slow, and his lips formed one silent word, clear as daylight. Sell. Kora didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She turned the mule's head and rode out of Better Creek, letting the town shrink behind her in a trail of dust. On the road back, buzzards circled high in the heat, lazy and patient. Kora watched them for a moment, then tightened her grip on the reins. If she'd come to town hoping for help, she rode home knowing something colder. Out here, the law was a door that only opened for certain kinds of men. And if she was going to keep her spring, her cabin, and her life, she was going to have to do it the same way she'd done everything else. Alone, Kora rode back into her valley late in the afternoon, the packs on her mule swaying with every step. The sun was still high enough to sting, but it had lost that sharp noontime arrogance. From the trail, she could already see the thin, steady curl of smoke near the ridge. The Apache camp was exactly where she'd left it. For a moment, that steadiness hit her harder than fear ever had. It wasn't a passing inconvenience. It wasn't a misunderstanding that would blow away with the wind. Those men were anchored to her land, like they'd driven stakes into the earth itself. She kept her distance, guiding the mule in a wide arc. As she passed, she felt eyes on her, quiet, unblinking attention. Gotchmen stood near their low fire and watched her go by without a word, without a step in her direction. That calm should have been reassuring. Instead, it made her skin prickle. It felt like confidence, like patience with teeth behind it. Kora reached the cabin, unloaded her flour and salt, and barred the door from the inside. Only then did she let herself exhale. Bitter Creek hadn't helped. The sheriff hadn't helped. The only thing she'd brought back was proof that no one was coming to save her, not from the riders by the ridge, and not from the clean-handed cattlemen who wanted her spring. That night, the wind came in hard from the south. It pushed at the cabin walls and rattled the tin roof like it was trying to pry the place open. The cottonwood groaned. Dust hissed across the ground in long, low sheets. Kora sat in lamplight like her rifle close, listening, every nerve tuned tight. And beneath the wind, she heard something else. A steady, rhythmic tapping, stone on stone, slow, deliberate. It wasn't loud, but the desert has a way of carrying sound when it wants to. The tapping didn't sound like threat, it sounded like work, like a man shaping something in the dark because his hands needed to stay busy. Kora stared at the shadowed wall until the lamp flame steadied again. The sound kept going a while, then faded. She didn't sleep much, not truly. She drifted and woke in thin slices, the way people do when they're expecting a knock on the door that could end their life. Morning came pale and quiet, the wind tired at last. Kora stepped outside and found her chicken pen damaged, wire bent, a branch collapsed across the top, feathers scattered in the dirt. The hens huddled in the corner, offended at the whole situation. Kora swore under her breath, grabbed her hammer and pliers and went to work. She was bent over the broken wire when a shadow fell across the ground. She straightened fast, hammer raised, heart thumping once, hard. Two Apache men stood a respectful distance away. One older, streaks of gray in his hair. One younger, quick-eyed. They didn't approach. They didn't speak. The older man pointed toward the branch, then to the broken wire, then made a small motion with his hands, an unmistakable offer, let us. Kora's first instinct was to refuse. Pride rose up like a wall. But pride didn't fix fences. Pride didn't feed hens. Pride didn't keep a woman alive out here. She swallowed. Fine, she said stiffly, stepping aside. But you don't come near the cabin. They nodded once and got to work. They lifted the branch together, muscles straining with real weight, and rolled it away. The older man produced rawhide strips and began repairing the wire with neat, practiced skill of someone who'd mended worse under worse conditions. In minutes, the fence stood straighter than before. When they were done, they didn't wait for thanks. They simply gave Kora a brief nod and walked back toward the ridge. Kora stood there holding her useless hammer, rainless morning air cooling the sweat on her skin. She didn't know what to do with kindness, not the sort that didn't ask for something right away. A little later, she found another gift on the flat stone near her porch. This time, a dressed quail, cleanly done, carefully placed. She stared at it a long moment, then carried it inside and cooked it, because the desert didn't allow waste, and because, whether she liked it or not, the rules of survival didn't change just because the world had gotten strange. After that, the exchange started without anyone agreeing to it. Game appeared by her doorstep, a rabbit, then a small deer haunch. Kora answered by leaving squash and beans from her garden on the same stone. It was never spoken about, never negotiated, just a quiet trade that said, in the only language both sides trusted, "We understand something now." Still, the question gnawed at her. Why her? Why this valley? And why did it feel like the town, far away beyond the ridges, was tightening into a fist she couldn't see? One afternoon, Kora walked Mercy, her mule, along the edge of the yard. The animal was stubborn, but dependable, the closest thing Kora had to steady company. Then, a rattlesnake buzzed from the grass like a tiny saw. Mercy jerked and bolted. The lead rope ripped through Kora's hands, burning her palms. The mule ran straight into a mesquite thicket, where thorns could tear an eye or split skin in an instant. Kora took off after her, boots pounding hard earth, breath sharp in her throat. She was fast, but Mercy was faster. Then Gotchman moved. He came from the side, not charging straight at the mule, but angling with instinct and purpose. He ran with long, controlled strides, closing the distance without wasting motion. As he approached Mercy, he spoke in a low voice, Apache words, soft and rhythmic. The mule slowed, not because she was cornered, because she was listening. Gotchman reached her and laid one hand on her neck. He didn't yank the rope, he didn't fight her. He just murmured, steady as water, until Mercy's frantic breathing eased and her legs stopped trembling. Kora arrived a moment later and froze, watching like she'd stumbled into a world she didn't understand. She had always handled animals through stubbornness and strength. Gotchman handled them through calm. He led Mercy back toward the homestead and stopped at the boundary line Kora had drawn days earlier. Even now, after all the silent gifts, after all the waiting, he respected it. He held the rope out. Kora took it carefully, avoiding his hand. "You've got a way with animals," she said, more accusation than compliment. Gotchman's mouth tilted, almost a smile. Animals know when hands mean harm. Kora's eyes narrowed. People don't. Gotchman looked at her for a beat, and the moment stretched. Then he stepped back, letting the rope fully pass into her control, and walked away without pressing anything further. That evening, Kora sat on her porch with coffee cooling in a tin cup. The sky turned the color of rust and bruises over the mountains. Wind moved through the cottonwood, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt crowded with possibility. And somewhere, far off, too far to make out words, she imagined the sound of a town. Men talking, glasses clinking, rumors being shaped the way stones were shaped, tap by patient tap. Kora stared toward the horizon, a tightness settling behind her ribs, because she knew the desert well enough to recognize the feeling. It wasn't peace. It was the pause right before something breaks. The evening came in red and heavy, the kind of sunset that made the Dragoon Mountains look like they'd been forged and left to cool. Heat still clung to the valley floor, but the light was softening, stretching shadows long across Kora Abernathy's yard. Kora sat on her porch step with her rifle across her knees, cleaning it the way she cleaned everything, thoroughly, quietly, like the act itself could keep the world in order. The metal caught the last light. The oiled rag moved in slow circles. It was a ritual, and she needed rituals now. She paused mid-wipe, not because she saw something, but because she felt the shift that always came before it, that faint change in the air, the sense of being approached. When she looked up, Gochimin was walking toward the cabin alone. He didn't rush, he didn't creep. He simply moved with that same deliberate calm that had unsettled her from the first day. He stopped at the line she'd scratched into the dirt, 10 paces out, and held there, as if he could feel the boundary even if it had already started to fade under wind and footsteps. "Kora Abernathy," he said, respectful, voice low. "You should know why we came." Kora didn't stand. She didn't invite him closer. She set the rag down on her thigh and stared at him like she was weighing a tool for flaws. "If it's another speech about protection and blankets, save your breath." "It is older than blankets," Gochimin replied. That made her still. The desert had a way of carrying old things, bones, rusted cans, forgotten promises. She didn't like the sound of older. Gochimin drew a breath, slow and steady, then began, not like a man trying to persuade her, but like a man reciting something he'd been made to carry. "When I was a boy, my people moved through these mountains after fighting south of the border. Men with rifles hunted us for money." Kora's eyes narrowed. She'd heard the stories in town, scalp bounties, men turning murder into a job. Gochimin's gaze lifted briefly toward the ridge, as if he could see the past laid over the present land. "My uncle was wounded," Gochimin continued. "A bullet broke bone. He could not ride. The hunters were close." Kora's throat tightened. She didn't know why yet, only that something in her memory was stirring, like a door that hadn't opened in years suddenly shifting on its hinges. He hid in a narrow wash, under brush and stone. He thought he would die there. Gochimin's eyes returned to her, steady as ever. A white man found him, alone, carrying a rifle and a map case, hair the color of dry grass, eyes like morning. Kora's breath caught. Gochimin nodded once, as if her face had answered for her. Kora Abernathy. Hearing her father's name from another man's mouth felt wrong and right at the same time, like a song you haven't heard since childhood, suddenly remembered. Kora's voice came out thin. "My father. He did not shoot. He did not leave. He hid my uncle and brought him water. Then he returned at night and led him here." Kora's mind flashed with an old, half-formed image, lamplight in the cabin, her mother's tense voice, her father hauling something heavy through the doorway, a shape in the bed that didn't belong there, dark and motionless, while her mother told her to be quiet. She had always assumed it was a dream. Gochimin kept speaking, and the words filled in the missing corners. "Your mother cleaned the wound. Your father set the bone with tools meant for animals. They kept him alive. They hid him when the hunters came searching." Kora swallowed hard. The sunset light made everything look soft, but her chest felt tight as rope. "For 3 days, Gochimin went on, your father lied to the hunters with a calm face and a gun on the table. He did not betray my uncle. He did not take money. He did not take a scalp." Kora stared at the porch boards. She could almost smell the cabin the way it used to smell. Hot pine, lamp oil, boiled water, and under it something sharp and unfamiliar. Fear. Gochimin's voice lowered, not for drama, but because reverence has its own quiet. "When my uncle was strong enough to leave," he said, "your father gave him food and a mule. He showed him a hidden pass through the mountains." The wind lifted, gentle now, turning the cottonwood leaves silver. Kora didn't move. Gochimin continued. "Before my uncle rode away, he made a promise to your father, not written on paper, not spoken for show. He said, 'Your house saved my house. When you have need, you will not stand alone.'" Kora's hands tightened on the rag until her knuckles turned pale. "So this is what you call need?" she asked, forcing the words out. "Marrying me?" Gochimin shook his head once. "Not need, not payment." His eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw a trace of weariness there, something human under all that stone. "My uncle is gone now," he said. "Before he died, he gave his promise to me. He told me to find the spring girl, to guard her, to join her to our people if she would accept, to make the promise real while there are still men who remember." Kora sat very still, the way you sit when you're afraid your body will betray what your face refuses to show. "You're telling me," she said, slow, "that this started when I was a child?" Gochimin nodded. "Yes." Kora looked past him toward the ridge, where the other riders were shadows against the last light. They weren't strangers anymore, not entirely. They were the weight of a vow that had been carried across years and blood. Then Gochimin's expression hardened slightly, not anger, but warning. "Men like Dane are also real," he said. "He wants your water. The law in Bitter Creek is small. He will come with more men. He will call it rescue. He will call it righteousness. It will be theft dressed in clean clothes. The name hit Kora like a slap. She thought of Dane's smile, the silent word he'd shaped at her in town. Sell. Her mouth went dry. You know him. We know of him, and we know thirst. It makes men do many things, then pretend they are innocent. Kora's gaze dropped toward the spring, toward the cottonwood roots and the water that had kept her alive. She'd always thought the spring was her shield. Now she saw it was also a beacon. She forced herself to look back up at Guchimin. If your uncle promised my father protection, she said, that was between them, not me. Guchimin's voice stayed calm, but it carried something immovable. You are your father's blood. That simple truth landed heavier than any threat. Kora felt the valley around her change shape. The cabin she'd clung to as a fortress suddenly looked like a small wooden box in a wide, hungry world. She had wanted solitude like armor. She had worn it so long she forgot it could become a cage. Guchimin stood there outside her line, not pushing, not pleading, only waiting to offer the truth he had been sent to deliver. Kora's laugh came out low and bitter. You're not much for sweet talk. A flicker crossed Guchimin's mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to surprise her. Sweet talk is for men who have time. I have only truth. The sun slipped behind the mountains. The sky turned darker, the red fading into bruised purple. In the new dimness, Kora could hear the spring more clearly, a constant whisper over stone. She looked at Guchimin again, really looked, not at the weapons behind him, not at the camp on her land, but at the man himself. He was not here for sport. He was not here. Dane didn't ride in at noon. Men who planned to do something ugly preferred dusk, when shadows help them pretend they're doing the Lord's work instead of plain old theft. That night, clouds swallowed the moon. The air felt thick and wrong, like rain that couldn't decide whether to fall. Inside her cabin, Kora Abernathy sat at the table with her rifle close, running a cloth along the barrel more for comfort than cleanliness. The lamplight made the log walls look tighter than they were. Then Mercy brayed. Not a bored sound, not a hungry sound, a sharp, startled warning that cut straight through the quiet. A heartbeat later, Kora heard it too. Shod hooves, too many of them, moving fast, clumsy. Town horses, not Apache ponies, men riding with anger, not skill. She rose in one smooth motion, snatched up the rifle, and stepped onto the porch. The lantern spill behind her into the night like a small, helpless halo. Down in the valley, torchlight flickered. A scattered line of riders pushed in across her land, loud in the way only men with whiskey and company get loud. Someone shouted her name like it belonged to them. Kora, you in there? The voice was Deputy Sloan from Bitter Creek, thin mustache, thick appetite for being important. He rode near the front, sitting tall as if the badge on his chest could stop bullets. And there, just behind him, was Cyrus Dane. Even at night, he looked too clean. Hat brim low, vest buttoned, posture composed, like this was business, like he was arriving to collect a debt, not start a slaughter. We're here to save you, Miss Abernathy, Dane called up toward the cabin. His voice carried that easy confidence of a man speaking for an audience, even when there wasn't one. I'm not held, she shouted back. Get off my land. Dane's horse sidestepped, nervous under the smell of torches and sweat. Dane didn't sound nervous at all. You don't have to lie for him. We'll handle it. Somewhere in the mob, a drunk laughed. Another voice slurred, Shoot the cabin! Smoke him out! Kora's mouth went dry. She had expected Dane to come again, sooner or later. She had not expected him to bring a mob and dress it up as Mercy. Then a shot cracked from the crowd below. Not from Kora, not from the ridge. A wild pistol shot that hit the cabin doorframe, sending splinters flying, close enough to kill, close enough to say the words were over. Kora didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Her father's lessons took over. Once bullets start, hesitation is just a slower form of dying. She fired back, but not at a man. She aimed at a torch. The flame dropped into the dirt and went out with a hiss, darkness swallowing it. For a brief instant, the whole valley hung in a strange pause. Then the ridge answered. Muzzle flashes sparked from the rocks, controlled, measured fire. Two of Dane's riders toppled from their saddles before they understood what they were facing. Horses screamed, men cursed, torches spun and rolled in the dust like fallen stars. The Apache weren't charging, they weren't whooping, they weren't giving the mob anything easy to shoot at. They were hunting. Kora worked her rifle from the porch, each shot chosen, each lever pull practiced. Brass casings flicked into the night, recoil bit her shoulder. She fired again and watched a man crumple off his horse like a sack dropped from a wagon. Below, Dane yelled orders no one followed. Drunk courage shrank fast when the enemy stayed invisible. 3 riders broke toward the cabin, thinking they could end it by getting close. Kora tracked the first and dropped him before he reached the steps. The second horse skidded sideways and bolted, rider cursing as he clung on. The third man jumped down and ran for the porch like a desperate thief. Kora swung her rifle, and Gatchaman appeared out of the dark. Not with theatrics, not like a ghost, like a man who had simply decided the night would not take what was his to protect. He intercepted the attacker at the base of the steps, grabbed his arm, and wrenched the rifle away with a twist that made the man cry out. Then, Gatchaman shoved him backward. The attacker hit the dirt hard and stayed down, stunned and breathless. Kora stared for a half heartbeat, shocked by how close Gatchaman was, how solid, how real. "Inside," he said, low. Kora didn't move. "This is my home." Gatchaman's jaw tightened, not in anger, almost in grim respect. Then he turned his attention back to the valley, scanning like he could read motion in darkness the way Kora read weather. The fight didn't last long. Men like Dane hired noise, not discipline. Faced with shots from unseen positions and seeing their friends fall, the posse broke. Horses wheeled, riders fled, spurring hard toward the trail back to Bitter Creek. One by one, torches went out as men dropped them to run faster. When it ended suddenly. Gunfire stopped like a door slammed. Smoke and dust hung low. A wounded horse whinnied. Somewhere someone moaned in the dirt. Kora stepped down from the porch with her rifle still ready. Her boots crunched grit. She moved toward the center of the yard, where the last of Dane's confidence had been forced into a crouch behind a fallen horse. Cyrus Dane looked up, and whatever polish he'd brought from town was gone. Dust coated his lips, sweat shone at his hairline. His hands fumbled over a pistol he couldn't reload fast enough. 7 Apache warriors emerged from the rocks and shadows, closing in without hurry. They formed a quiet half-circle around him, not shouting, not taunting, just there, like a judgment you can't outrun. Kora stood beside Gatchaman, rifle angled down but present. Dane swallowed. "You don't know what you're doing," he rasped, trying to find the old voice that made listen. Kora's expression didn't change. "You came to steal my land," she said. "You dressed it up as rescue so you could sleep at night." Dane's eyes flicked to Gatchaman. "You think you can just own her?" he snapped, reaching for one last insult. "Like a treaty?" Gatchaman's voice was quiet, sharp as flint. "She is not owned." Kora stepped closer, and the muzzle of her rifle tracked Dane's chest. "Get up." Dane hesitated, then stood, legs unsteady. He looked around like he expected death to come down on him any second. It didn't. Instead, Gatchaman delivered something colder than killing. He spoke a short command in Apache. 2 men moved in and stripped Dane of his weapons. By the time the first survivors staggered back into Bitter Creek, the town was already settling into its usual nighttime routine. Lamps lit, saloon doors swinging, men talking loud to prove they weren't afraid of the dark. That routine didn't survive 5 minutes. A rider slid off his saddle in front of the saloon, clutching his ribs like he was trying to keep himself from spilling out onto the street. Another man came in pale as old paper, talking too fast, eyes too wide, breath stinking of panic and smoke. The story poured out in broken pieces. Gunfire in the valley, shadows on the ridge, men dropping out of saddles, horses screaming, and Cyrus Dane limping back barefoot like the world had finally slapped him hard enough to leave a mark. Inside the saloon, poker hands stopped mid-deal. A whiskey bottle paused halfway to a mouth. Even the piano went quiet, as if the keys had heard something they didn't like. And as the tale spread from one table to the next, it changed the way frightened stories always change. More Apaches, more bullets, more blood, more horror than the truth probably held. But the fear stayed consistent. Fear didn't care about accuracy. It only cared about being believed. Somebody ran for Sheriff Holcomb. Holcomb listened with the same tired face he wore for drunks and bar fights, right up until the details stopped sounding like a brawl and started sounding like a mistake he couldn't ignore. His jaw tightened. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the dark line of the mountains. He didn't want to go. A man could see that plain as day. But a sheriff's job in a place like Bitter Creek wasn't about courage. It was about keeping the town from turning on itself. And when men got scared, they either begged for law or they became law. So Holcomb saddled up. Before dawn, he rode out with a handful of deputies, hooves thudding soft on the hard ground, dust lifting in a pale ribbon behind them. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that made everything look unfinished. The desert lay open and indifferent, stretching toward the dragoons like it had no opinion on who deserved to live. As they rode, Holcomb's men grew quieter. The closer they got, the more the land seemed to swallow sound. Even their horses felt it, ears flicking, nostrils flaring, stepping a little more carefully than they had leaving town. When they finally crested into Kora Abernathy's valley, the posse slowed without being told. They expected chaos. They expected a burned cabin, a captive woman, a pile of bodies scattered like trash. What they found was worse, in a way. Order. Kora sat on her porch with a tin mug of coffee like it was any other morning. Her rifle leaned nearby, not raised, not hidden, just present, like a tool put where it belonged. The cabin stood solid. The garden still held its stubborn green. The spring ran clear under the cottonwood. Off to one side, bodies had been gathered and covered with canvas, weighed down with stones so the wind wouldn't lift the corners. No spectacle, no disrespect, just the grim neatness of people who understood death didn't need decoration. Holcomb pulled his horse to a stop and stared, trying to fit what he saw into the story he'd been fed. "Miss Abernathy," he called, and his voice came out cautious. You all right?" Kora looked up at him like she'd been expecting this exact question and had already grown tired of it. "I'm breathing. That's more than I can say for the men who fired on my house." Holcomb's eyes flicked to the covered shapes. "Dane claims he came to rescue you." Kora's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Does it look like I needed rescuing, Sheriff?" Behind her, Gotchiman stood in the yard, tall, still, and quiet as a post driven into the earth. He didn't loom, he didn't threaten, he simply existed in a way that made Holcomb's authority feel small. The deputies shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near holsters, not sure what they were supposed to do with a scene that didn't match their expectations. A couple of them glanced toward the ridge, where Apache warriors sat and stood in disciplined calm, cleaning rifles in the brightening light as if the morning had brought chores, not war. Holcomb cleared his throat. "Dane said you were being held hostage." Kora set her coffee down and stood. No hurry, no show. Then she stepped off the porch and moved until she was beside Gotchiman, shoulder to shoulder, making the picture painfully clear. "Sterling Dane is a liar," she said, voice steady. "He tried to murder me for my land. These men," she nodded toward Gotchiman and the ridge, "saved my life." Holcomb looked from her to Gotchiman, then to the covered bodies, then back to the valley, as if hoping someone would hand him a simpler version of the world. Nothing did. He swallowed and the fight drained from him. "All right," he said finally, voice flat. "We'll take care of the bodies." His men dismounted and approached the canvas-covered dead with the careful, embarrassed movements of people who knew they'd arrived late. They lifted and loaded, shoulders straining under real weight, boots scuffing dust. No one spoke much. There wasn't anything useful left to say. When the wagon finally rolled out and the deputies mounted to follow, Holcomb avoided looking directly at Gotchiman. He gave Kora one last uneasy glance, like he didn't know whether to be angry at her or ashamed of himself, then rode away, leaving the valley to its quiet again. And that quiet was different now. Not the old kind, empty and sharp-edged. This was quieter in a deeper way. The sort of quiet that comes after a storm breaks and the sky clears, when the world feels like it's waiting to see what grows back. Kora stood in the yard, watching the dust trail of the sheriff's wagon fade into the distance. Then she turned toward Gatchiman. He studied her face a long moment, as if confirming something. Then he spoke, softly. Men like Dane will not forget thirst. The storm didn't roll in politely. It came over the Dragoon Mountains like a debt finally collected. Dark clouds dragging their bellies over the peaks, lightning clawing at the sky, and rain falling in hard sheets that turned dust into mud in minutes. Kora Abernathy stood in her doorway and watched it hit her valley. The cabin roof rattled under the downpour. Water ran off the tin in silver streams. The cottonwood by the spring bowed and shuddered, its leaves flashing pale in the wind. For a moment, the land looked almost unfamiliar, washed clean, shining, and dangerous. Down near the ridge, the Apache camp moved with quiet purpose. No shouting, no scrambling, just men tightening ropes, shifting bedrolls, moving ponies to higher ground like they'd done it 100 times before. Their calm made the storm feel less like chaos and more like a test. Kora was still watching when a sound cut through thunder, sharp, distant, unmistakable. A rifle shot. Not close, far off, swallowed by rain and echo, but real enough to raise the hair on her arms. Ironwood Pass. People in Bitter Creek told stories about that cut through the Dragoons. Wagons breaking, horses spooking, lights moving on the rocks at night. Towns always built legends around places that could kill you without trying. In a storm like this, Ironwood Pass didn't need legends. Gatchiman appeared at the edge of her porch like the rain had shaped him out of shadow. His hair clung damp to his face, his eyes fixed toward the mountains. "Someone is in the pass," he said. Kora's jaw tightened. In this weather, nobody's sane. Another distant crack of a rifle answered for him, fainter this time, but there. Gatchiman didn't waste words, not sane or not free to choose. Kora hesitated only a beat. She could have stayed behind her barred door. She could have told herself it wasn't her problem. But the desert had raised her on a brutal kind of truth. If you ignore a cry long enough, one day it'll be yours. She grabbed her slicker and rifle. "We're going." Gatchiman gave a short signal toward the ridge. In moments, the rest of his men were moving, mounting up in the rain with controlled efficiency, gathering reins, checking straps. No drama, just readiness. Kora swung into the saddle and followed as the small group pushed into the storm. The trail toward Ironwood Pass turned slick fast. Hooves splashed through shallow rivulets. Mud sucked at boots when they dismounted to guide the horses over wet stone. Lightning flashed and made the world turn white for a heartbeat, then black again, the thunder arriving like a giant closing a door. When the pass finally rose in front of them, it looked like a stone throat, narrow walls, jagged edges, water pouring down in curtains. The air smelled of wet rock, sharp and clean, almost strange in a land that usually smelled like dust and heat. They slowed, careful, and then Kora saw it. A wagon, jammed sideways across the trail, wheel snapped, canvas sagging under rain, the entire path blocked. Something about it felt wrong even before she spotted the men. Two figures huddled under the wagon edge, soaked through, faces tense. One had blood running down his scalp. Another clutched a pistol with a shaking hand. A third lay in the mud, groaning, trying to push himself up like the ground was made of knives. Bandits. Not Apache, not soldiers, just white men with hungry eyes and a plan that had fallen apart in bad weather. When Kora and the riders emerged through the rain, the bandits froze. The one with the pistol lifted it toward Kora, but the barrel wobbled as if even the gun didn't believe in him. "Back off," he shouted. "This ain't your business." Kora kept her rifle steady. Rain ran off her hat brim and down her cheek, cold as judgment. The man's eyes flicked past her shoulder and landed on the Apache riders, silent, mounted, watching. His face drained so fast it was almost comical. "Oh, hell," he breathed. Kora moved toward the wagon, boots sliding in mud and catching again. "What happened here?" she demanded. The bandit's mouth worked like he wanted a lie but couldn't find one that fit. "We were taking the freight," he said finally. "Just money." "Then why the shooting?" Kora snapped. He hesitated, then looked away. Because there's a girl in the wagon." Something cold tightened in Kora's chest. She reached for the canvas flap and pulled it back. Inside, dim and cramped, a teenage girl stared out with huge, terrified eyes. Dirt streaked her face, tears mixed with rain. Her hands were tied tight, rope biting into skin. She tried to speak and only managed the broken sob. Kora climbed in, careful with the slick boards, and cut the ropes with her knife. The girl lunged forward and grabbed Kora's sleeve like she was holding onto the only solid thing left in the world. The girl's voice came out in a rush. They said Apaches would take me." Kora glanced out through the rain at Gatchiman, standing still, calm, unreadable. Then she looked back at the girl and spoke dryly, almost grimly, because sometimes humor is the only way to keep fear from winning. "Well, they lied about that too," Kora said. Outside, Gatchiman spoke a short command in Apache. Two of his men moved in and disarmed the bandits with swift, efficient motions. No unnecessary cruelty, no hesitation. The pistols were taken, the men were pulled to their feet and held away from the wagon like they were already yesterday's problem. The storm didn't care. Rain kept falling. Water kept running down the pass walls. The broken wagon wheels sank deeper into mud like the earth was trying to swallow evidence. There was no safe way to drag the girl to Bitter Creek in that weather. The trail would be treacherous, and night was coming fast. So Kora made the call. They brought the girl back to the cabin. By the time they reached the valley again, the storm was easing, but the air was still wet and cold. Kora guided the girl inside, gave her dry clothes, a blanket, and coffee hot enough to burn warmth back into her hands. The girl's name was Elsie Hart, daughter of a freight agent, unlucky enough to be on the wrong wagon at the wrong time. At dawn, Elsie sat on Kora's porch wrapped in a blanket, staring toward the ridge like she expected the camp to vanish when the sun rose. The Apache men were there, the same as always, quiet, orderly. Gatchiman moved among the ponies, rubbing one down with a cloth, steam rising faint from its coat in the cool morning air. His hands were gentle, steady, like he was speaking to the animal without words. Elsie swallowed hard. "They're not like the stories," she whispered. Kora leaned on the porch post beside her, eyes on the ridge. Her voice came out calm, almost tired. "Most things aren't." And as she watched Gatchiman tend to the horses like a man born to responsibility, Kora felt that familiar unease shift again, into something more complicated. The valley was still dangerous, the town was still out there, men like Dane still wanted her spring. But for the first time, the silence around her didn't feel empty, it felt guarded. Morning came bright and sharp over Kora Abernathy's valley. The kind of clean light that made every footprint in the dust look like evidence. The storm had washed the air, but it hadn't washed away the feeling that something was coming. Kora was on her porch when she saw 3 riders crest a rise and angle straight toward the spring. They didn't ride like neighbors. They didn't ride like men looking for directions. They rode with purpose, steady pace, shoulders stiff, eyes scanning the ridge as if expecting it to bite. At the front was a U.S. Marshal, the kind of man who wore authority like a coat and assumed it fit everywhere. 2 deputies followed behind him, and beside them, clean vest, polished boots, a face that tried hard to look calm, rode Cyrus Dane. Kora's expression didn't change as they entered her yard. She didn't step back into the cabin, she didn't reach for panic. She simply stood where she belonged, with her rifle close enough to touch and her eyes fixed on the men who thought paper could move mountains. The marshal pulled up and reached into his coat. He unfolded a legal notice in the sunlight like he was opening scripture. He began to read, voice stiff and official, as if the words themselves were a weapon. Kora let him get a few lines in before she laughed, one short, dry sound that held no humor. "That's what you brought out here? Paper?" The marshal's jaw tightened. He didn't like being interrupted. He didn't like being doubted. "Miss Abernathy," he said, continuing as if her voice didn't count, "this notice states—" Kora cut him off, still calm. "I'm not leaving. My father filed this claim. It's recorded. This is my homestead." Dane leaned in his saddle, smooth as oil. "I'm trying to keep the territory safe, Miss Abernathy. A woman alone out here, surrounded by—" He didn't finish because Gatchiman stepped into view. He didn't rush, he didn't posture. He simply appeared at the edge of the yard like the land itself had decided to stand up. Tall, still, hands relaxed at his sides, dark eyes steady in the sun. You could see the marshal's confidence falter in the smallest ways. The legal paper wavered a fraction, his horse shifted its weight. One of the deputies' hands hovered near his revolver, without quite committing. The marshal tried to recover his voice. "You understand this is United States territory," he said, a line spoken more for himself than anyone else. Gatchiman looked at him as if he were studying a man who insisted the sky belonged to him. "You draw lines on paper. We understand," Gatchiman said quietly. Kora didn't move. "Marshal," she said, "if you came to remove me, you'll have to try. And if you try, you'll be the one explaining bodies back in Bitter Creek." The marshal's eyes tightened. He was used to people backing down when he spoke. He was used to fear. He wasn't used to a woman standing on her own porch like she'd already decided the outcome. "You are obstructing lawful process," he snapped. Kora held his gaze. "I'm trespassing." For a moment, the valley went so quiet it felt staged, just wind and the soft sound of the spring behind the cottonwood. Then, at the ridge, movement began. Not dramatic, not sudden. Apache warriors stepped into view one at a time from behind rocks and brush, 7 of them, spaced out in calm stillness, rifles held low, watching without challenge. The marshal saw them and swallowed. The deputy saw them and stopped breathing like men who suddenly remembered they had families. Dane tried to keep his face composed, but his smile tightened at the edges. This wasn't the picture he wanted. He wanted Kora small. He wanted her alone. He wanted her frightened enough to sign something, anything. The standoff stretched. Dust drifted in thin sheets across the yard. And then the truth came from behind a boulder. A rifle cracked from the far side of the valley. The shot slammed into the porch post near Kora, exploding wood into sharp splinters. It wasn't a warning. It was an attempt. A real one. Close enough that the next shot could have ended her. Kora ducked fast, shoulder tucking instinctively. At the same instant, Kochiman grabbed her and pulled her behind the porch wall. Not gentle, efficient, protective without hesitation. The marshal shouted, "Cease fire," like the word could drag a bullet back into its barrel. Dane shouted too, angry and panicked. "Stop, stop, you fools!" But men who come to steal don't stop because someone yells law. They stop when fear outweighs greed. 2 hired gunmen were visible now, firing again from cover. Muzzle smoke puffed low, bullets snapped off stone and snapped through scrub. They weren't aiming at the marshal. They weren't aiming at the deputies. They were aiming at Kora. Kora leaned out from cover, cheek pressed to her rifle stock, eyes steady. She didn't fire to kill, not yet. She fired once into the dirt near the ambushers' feet, a sharp puff of dust that told them exactly what kind of shot she could make if she chose. "Get off my land," she shouted, voice cutting clean through the chaos. The Apache answered, and they answered differently than Dane's men. Not wild shooting, not noise for the sake of noise. Measured shots from the ridge, positions shifting like a tide around rocks. A rock chipped beside one hired man's head. Another round struck so close it threw gravel into his face. The ambushers flinched. They fired once more, then broke. They scrambled from cover, boots slipping on loose stone, running for horses they could barely control. Greed turned into panic fast when it met discipline. The marshal and his deputies sat frozen, trapped between authority and the reality that their badges meant nothing here. You could see it on their faces. They had come to enforce a story, and instead, they'd walked into someone else's truth. As the gunfire died, dust and smoke drifted in the sunlight. The valley went quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes when everyone is counting who's still standing. Kora stepped out from behind the porch post, rifle lowered but ready, and fixed her eyes on Dane. "That's what you brought? Paper, badges, and hidden guns?" Dane's face had gone gray. His mouth worked, searching for words that could put control in his hands. None came. Kochiman stood beside Kora, silent and steady, not touching her, not claiming her, simply there, the way a wall is there. The marshal slowly folded his notice back into neat quarters, as if the paper embarrassed him now. He turned his horse, stiff-backed, and gestured for his deputies to withdraw. Pride swallowed, survival chosen. Dane lingered a heartbeat longer, eyes burning with frustration and humiliation, then turned sharply and rode out as well, retreating with his clean boots and dirty intentions. Kora watched them disappear toward the open desert. She didn't chase them, she didn't celebrate. She simply reached out and touched the splintered porch post where the bullet had struck, wood dust sticking to her fingers. Then she looked to the spring, still running clear, and she understood something with cold certainty. The town had finally shown its hand, and the valley had answered back. Dawn came quietly over Kora Abernathy's valley, the kind of morning that feels too clean after trouble. The Dragoon Mountains held a pale glow along their edges, and the spring ran as it always had, clear water sliding over stone, steady and indifferent to whatever men decided to do on its banks. Kora knelt there for a long moment, watching her own reflection break and reform in the ripples. For years, that water had been her reason to stay alive. It fed her garden, kept her animals standing, and drew a sharp line between survival and death in a land that offered very little mercy. It was also the reason strangers kept finding her. Behind the cottonwood, Kochiman approached without sound. He didn't crowd her. He didn't try to soften his presence with false smiles. He simply stopped a respectful distance away, as if the spring itself demanded a certain kind of honesty. Kora rose slowly. They faced each other with the water between them, the cabin behind, and the ridge beyond, quiet, watchful, holding the shapes of men and horses like shadows that refused to leave. Gochiman spoke first, voice low and even. The promise, he told her, had been honored. The danger had been answered. If she wanted them gone now, they would go. No anger, no punishment, no last word meant to win. It wasn't a test. It was the cleanest kind of choice. Kora didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted past him toward the cabin, those thick logs her father had stacked into a small fortress. She could picture every inch of it in the dark. She could name every creak in the floorboards. For most of her life, that place had been proof she could stand alone. Lately, it had started to feel like proof of something else. She turned and walked back toward it, boots crunching gravel, shoulders tight with thoughts she didn't know how to say out loud. Inside, the cabin smelled of iron, wood smoke, and the faint sour bite of old dust. The table, the lamp, the hanging tools, everything there was practical. Everything there had been shaped for one set of hands. On a peg near the door hung her father's worn leather map case. Nearby sat a small Bible with cracked covers. She didn't pick either one up. She simply looked at them, letting the past sit where it belonged, and felt the truth of it settle. She could honor what her father built without spending the rest of her life trapped inside it. Out back, beneath the cottonwood, two simple graves waited in the shade. Kora stood there a moment, hand resting on weathered wood, thumb rubbing the rough grain. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The wind moved through the leaves like quiet breath. When she returned to the spring, Gochiman was still waiting. No impatience, no shifting, just that steady presence that seemed threatening at first, until she realized it was something rarer out here than water. Kora stopped a few steps away and held his gaze. Her voice came out calm. No trembling, no performance. "Yes," she said. Not because of fear, not because of debt, not because she'd been cornered, because the word belonged to her. Gochiman lowered his eyes and bowed his head slightly, like a man accepting something sacred without trying to own it. There was no celebration, no shouting from the ridge, just a subtle change in the air, like a storm passing and leaving the land quieter in a different way. In the days that followed, life didn't turn soft. The territory didn't do soft. Kora harvested her squash and beans with the same steady hands she'd always used. She packed what mattered into bedrolls and canvas bags. She wrapped important papers in oilcloth, not to show anyone, just to keep them safe from rain and dust and men who liked to rewrite ownership with fire. She walked the boundary of her homestead at sunrise and sunset, looking at the fence, the garden, the spring, as if seeing it for the first time. It was still hers. That didn't change. What changed was the shape of her future around it. Sometimes she brought a crate of vegetables toward the ridge and left it near the camp. Apache hands took it with quiet respect. No ceremony, no bargaining, just the same honest exchange they'd built from the beginning. Food for food, presence for presence. One morning, Kora and Gochiman rode up to a rocky overlook above the valley. The air was clear and cool, and the whole world opened beneath them. Cabin roof catching sun, cottonwood shade pooling near the spring, the ridge line standing like a spine behind it all. The place looked smaller from above, not because it mattered less, but because it was no longer the only thing. Gochiman lifted a hand and pointed toward distant mountains, toward roads that weren't marked, toward country that didn't belong to any single story. He didn't tell her to go, he simply showed her the direction, as if saying, "When you're ready, there's more." Kora followed his gesture, then surprised herself with a small, genuine smile. Careful, like she didn't fully trust it yet. Far off on a trail, a young courier named Tomas passed through,
slowing his horse when he noticed the rich camp and the cabin tucked by the spring. He didn't ride in, he didn't speak to them, he simply watched from a distance, storing the image away the way men store away things they'll later turn into stories. Months later, around other fires, Tomas would tell it, in a voice made rough with wind and years. He'd describe a spring that never dried, a lone woman who didn't fold, and 7 riders who came not like raiders, but like a vow with legs. Travelers would listen with faces lit by ember glow, leaning in the way people lean towards something they can feel is true, even if they weren't there to see it. They'd start calling the place 7 Shadows Spring, and somewhere in that name, Kora's old life would remain, kept by the land, held by the water, watched by mountains that never learned how to look away. But the story wouldn't end at the cabin door, because Kora Abernathy, for the first time in a long time, wasn't living just to hold the world at a distance. She was living to step into it, on her own terms, with her own voice, finally answered by another.